GameSide.com. GameSide.com.
Bonjour. That's hello, right? I don't know. I never took French. This is MySQL Databases, or Relational Database Management System, RDBMS. MySQL is an open source database software named after the developer's daughter, My. A compatible version, MariaDB, Maria is daughter number 2, was created when Oracle bought MySQL. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, a system-independent language for any RDBMS. The SQL studied here works for most relational databases, commercial or open source. Every web host has slightly different MySQL setup. You need at least 4 values to use MySQL on a database host. Now I took some screenshots from one of the free hosts I set up, and I went into the control panel, and on there was a screen for databases. You can see over here there's a MySQL database link here and a PHP MyAdmin. Those are the two I mostly used. I pressed this button. This comes with a utility for creating a database, so I said okay. I typed in the name of the database and hit create database, and it came back and said here's the information you need to access your database. Number 1, you need the name of the database. It's related to that name I typed in up there. Number 2, you need a username. Everybody needs a username to access MySQL, and that's the one for this host. The password was a little obscure. I have to go look at it somewhere else. And finally, the host name. Just like you connect to a web server to get a web page, you have to connect to a MySQL server to use MySQL. Now I had to look this up a little farther. I went out to the main page of where the control panel was, and I scrolled down a little bit, and it did give me some MySQL details on the screen, and it turns out I had a special password, and I had to use the password they provided. I couldn't use my own. Every site is different. Your site might have slightly different screens, but the information is there. Trust me, it's there. All you got to do is look for it. MySQL Databases. There are 2 ways to use a MySQL database. Number 1, there's online utilities like PHP MyAdmin. Most hosts provide a utility to create a database, to add tables, insert and edit data into MySQL databases. Number 2, you can write a PHP program that calls MySQLi functions to update the database. For one-time tasks, use technique number 1. But this lesson will focus on number 2, programming. If you're going to set up one database with one table, I would be inclined to use the utilities to do that. If you're going to set up multiple databases and multiple tables, I'd write a program to do it. Let's set up 4 very, very important variables here right at the top of the code. Start with your web host. Every host is different. When you log on to edit your web page, there'll be a link on or near the control panel with your MySQL account settings. The values here are made up. I just made up these values right here. Your host will provide specific values for you. Or you could Google your host name, MySQL settings, and it'll come up. Everybody in this class might be using a different host. Take the name of your host, whatever it is, infinityfree.net, Amazon Web Services, whatever you're using, take the name of your host and MySQL settings. You Google that, they'll tell you what your host name is. They'll tell you what your username is. It's very clear. You're looking for your host name, your username, your password, and maybe a database name, depending on whether the host sets up a database for you. Sometimes you get to pick your database name, sometimes you don't. Now looking at each of the 4 items in detail. $host equals server.my.sql. Now I put this next to a website address for a good reason. There's a reason why $host looks like a web address. It kind of is. Just like a browser connects with a web server to get a web page, an SQL program will connect with a server to access the data. Your hosting company supplies this for you. All you have to do is look it up. This is a made-up address. Your server address will be different. $user equals SQL user. The host almost always assigns the username. Security is important when many users are sharing an SQL server. Most hosting sites assign you the MySQL username that may be a variation of your web hosting account username. To be clear, this is a separate logon from your web hosting. When you look up the server address for $host, the MySQL username should be listed right there next to it. In other words, if you can find this on your host, you can find the username right next to it. $PW equals XYZ. Security is critical. Protect your data. This is your MySQL password. If the web host assigns it, it will be listed near your $host and $user information. If you get to pick or change it, please don't use X, Y, and Z. Every hacker in the world has a program that will connect to your MySQL server and try the 100 most common passwords. Do not use a password this simple. Is seeing the password in the code a problem? When hackers can open and read your PHP code, security is already lost. In other words, if somebody has cracked into your system and they're looking at your code, you have already lost all security. Don't worry about them seeing that password. $DB name equals testDB. $DB name is short for database name. It's tricky because some web hosts automatically assign a name for you. Some add your account number to the name, and others will let you pick any DB name you want. While looking up $host and $user, check for it. If it's assigned, you'll see it right there. More important, web hosts have a simple utility to create /name your database. If you use this utility, you will set the $DB name to the database created by the utility. $SQLDB equals mysqli underscore connect, and I'll pass it three parameters, $host, $user, and $PW. As the name implies, connect to a MySQL server. The variable $SQLDB will connect your program to the server, and then the server will do the actual read and write to the database files on disk. All access to the data happens through $SQLDB. Calling mysqli connect different before and after you've created a database. Before you've created a database, you'll pass it three parameters. After you've already created a database, you can add DB name as a fourth parameter. We'll see that shortly. If not, mysqli underscore connect underscore error no. Always, always, always check for errors. The exclamation point means not. Read this line of code as if not an error. If not an error, execute the code. mysqli underscore connect underscore error no returns false when connect worked and an error number when it does not. An error would be caused by an incorrect value for $host or $user or $PW. Always check host documentation for the correct values. I would have done an if-else error check after MySQLi query and MySQLi Select DB down below if I had room on this slide. I'm always running out of spaces on my slides, so I have to limit some of the error checking. But always do check for errors whenever possible. Do as I say, not as I do. Error checking is critical. Before I move on, I want to make an important point here. Notice my diagram up here. $SQLDB is the variable we'll use to access the MySQL server, which in turn will access the database on the hard drive. The data flows from my variable through the server to the database, and when we're extracting data, it'll come from the database through the server back to my program. Print connected to $host : $user. A message to verify mysqli connect worked. Only prints if not an error. When testing and debugging, you want to see this message. but on a live web page, not so much. You may want to use a debug flag to turn this message on and off. Again, it's important to note I'm doing full error checking on this MySQL command. I'm not doing any down here, but I really should be. Exit error $host : $user. This will only execute when connect fails. Number 1. The reason for the connect fail will be printed by mysqli _connect _error. I wish I could tell you it always printed something clear like bad username, but usually I have to Google the error message or the error number to figure out exactly what went wrong. Number 2 point. Exit is a fatal error. Terminate the program. In this case, it is fatal. MySQLi query will never ever work if the connect fails. If I'm on a live web page, I might just do a warning, hey, I can't show you that data. But in this case, if you can't get to the data, we're going to call it a fatal error. Exit will leave the program. $query string equals create database $db name. SQL stands for Standard Query Language. MySQL and SQL are not the same thing. MySQL is a relational database that uses SQL commands. Oracle uses the same SQL commands. If, else, print are PHP commands. H1, B, and href are HTML commands. Every language has its own set of commands. Create database testdb is an SQL command to create a database testdb. The first of several SQL commands we will learn that work with any RDBMS. This is an SQL command that we will execute on our database. MySQLi query and pass it $SQLDB and the query string right here. Whoop, there it is. This is the most important command. MySQLi query sends an SQL command to an active connection $SQLDB, which then creates an empty database file on the hard disk. Follow the arrow. This command goes through this variable, sends the command to MySQL, which goes out onto the database and creates an empty database on the hard drive. All database changes assign an SQL command to $query string and call MySQLi query. Very bad. I did not have room to do error checking. I would have loved to put an if-else just like I did above for the connection. A misspelled word or an illegal character in $db name would cause this command to fail. I will put a better error check for SQLi query on the next slide. I promise. I'll have more room. MySQLi _select _db. Again, we'll pass it $SQLDB and the name of the database we'd like to select. At this point, if you plan to add tables and insert data, you need to select the active database. MySQLi Select DB also allows you to switch between multiple databases if that's needed. Note most MySQLi functions take $SQLDB as the first parameter. It is not a simple variable. It's more like an object or a structure that tracks the user, database name, and status, etc. of the connection. I'm showing it kind of like a simple variable, but it is not a simple variable. There's a whole bunch of information that gets stored into this variable, and that's why it's passed to all the MySQLi functions. This is your program's connection to the database. MySQLi _close and pass it $SQLDB. Very, very, very important. You must close the connection when you are done. Number 1, you don't get unlimited connections to a MySQL server. And number 2, the operating system frees locks placed on any disk files. This makes sure that someone else can access this database file. $SQLDB is not a simple variable. It's more like an object or a structure that allows you to access and track the server connection. After a close, any MySQLi call using $mysqldb would fail. Again, it's keeping track of the connection once you close it. Do not send this as a parameter to a function. Let's go back and look at MySQLi Connect one more time. After you have created a database, a fourth parameter is added to MySQLi Connect. This will connect and select $DB name without having to run MySQLi Select DB. If you use the host utility to create your database, you don't need any of the code that is crossed out here. This code to create the database and select it, if you've already gone with the utility and set up your database and created it, you don't need this. You can simply add this fourth parameter to the connect command, and it will open a connection and select the database at the same time. It's a simpler way to use it, and it's the way you call MySQLi Connect after the database has been created. Remember, creating the database is usually a one-time operation. SQL Tables, Relational Database Management System, RDBMS. To use MySQL on your computer, you can use XAMPP or a similar program to start the MySQL server. The admin button runs the PHP MyAdmin program. There are two critical buttons on XAMPP for using MySQL. The start and stop button. You've got to start the MySQL server before you can write SQL programs. And the second button is for admin. This will run PHP MyAdmin program, and there it is over here. PHP MyAdmin is a utility on many hosts that can create, edit, databases, tables, records, etc. Just about any edit you want to make to a database you can do through this utility. And more importantly, it's available on pretty much all web hosts, including XAMPP. I highlighted a couple things here. You can see you can create databases, type in a database name, hit the create button, and you've got a database set up. You can even create tables and edit tables. I've already built a table here. You can see I can look at the table. It has 2 columns. There's all sorts of edits and changes you can make. And again, it comes down to, are you doing it once? Or are you doing it multiple times? For any edit that you're only going to do one time, I generally use PHP MyAdmin. For something that I repeat over and over and over again, I write a program to do it. SQL Tables. Tables, 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 tables. Relational databases store data in row and column format. After you create a database, which we did on the previous slide, the next step is to create a table, which we'll do on this slide. Then we will insert data into that table. But tables is where the actual data gets stored. Once again, we have our very 4 important variables right there at the top of the code where we can easily see them and change them when needed. Testing and debugging with the XAMPP host. When you're writing code where you edit, upload, and then run, it's time consuming. I don't like to edit my web pages, then upload them, and then go to a browser and look at them. I like to be able to work on my computer without a connection to the internet, without having to upload anything to the server. And XAMPP allows you to do it. These are the XAMPP variables for connecting to a database. This is the XAMPP server address. This is the XAMPP username, and so on down the line. Localhost says use the SQL server on your computer. The root user is the system administrator, and the no password is a terrible idea. But it is okay because usually you're the only user on your computer. If you were doing this on a shared computer, don't use that password. But if it's on your computer and you're the only user, that is the default XAMPP password. I guess we can leave it. So what I do is I set up with these variable names and values. I run, I test, I run, I test, I change, I test. Once I get my code working the way I want, then I fill in my server values for these variables, upload the code, and do one final test when it gets to the server. $SQLDB equals mysqli connect, pass a $host, $user, $password, and $DB name. At this point, I assume you've already created a database. Now we can connect and select the database at the same time. Connect to the host and select the database $DB name. The fourth parameter means any SQL operation will apply to test DB. Design is important. The four variables set at the top are easily changed to web host values after testing. Oh, I hate myself for not doing an if-else error check after this connect, but I ran out of room. I wanted to do error checking for this command down here, so I had to sacrifice some error checking up here. Don't skip the error checking. Any operation using $SQLDB is routed through the server and applied to test DB. Again, this is not a simple variable. This is tracking our entire connection to MySQL. And of course, it'll be sent to the database when we apply commands to the database. $query string equals, and it's a big one, create table mytab. Parentheses means we're sending parameters. I want to set up a column 1 with a variable character of 7. Not null. Don't allow this field to be null. Make it the primary key, and then set up column 0 as the primary key. Then the second column will be column 1, and it will be a variable character of length 9. Whew, that is a doozy of an SQL command. SQL stands for Standard Query Language. This is the SQL command to create a table named mytab. It'll have two columns. Column 0, that's short for column 0, will have a length of 7, and it will be the primary key. And column 1 will have a length of 9. There are not a lot of SQL commands. It's pretty easy to learn SQL commands. There's create, there's insert, there's select. There's not a whole lot of SQL commands, so it's pretty easy to learn them. However, I usually cheat. I usually Google SQL create table, then look for examples online, and copy and paste and edit the closest match to what I want to create. That's how I do it. That's the way I recommend you do it. All I'm doing on this line of code, though, is creating a string. I have not executed this command yet. This is just setting up an SQL command in this variable $query string. MySQLi query, parentheses, $SQLDB, comma, query string. Whoop, there it is. That's the big command. Queries are the commands that do something to the database. They either put something in the database or they take something out of the database. This is the important command. That's why I always accent it with whoop, there it is. MySQLi query sends SQL commands to an active connection $SQLDB, which then creates a table on the disk in testDB. MySQLi functions take $SQLDB as the first parameter. This is not a simple variable. This is like an object or a structure that tracks the user, the database name, the status of the connection. By the way, you don't always have to call it $SQLDB. That's my preferred name. You could have called it $DB. You could call it $Connect. You can call this variable any name you want, but once you connect to it, use that variable name. Follow the arrow. We're going to send a command through $SQLDB. It's going to go through the MySQL server, and it's going to execute the command on the database. And you can see it's set up a mytable or mytab with two columns, column 0 and column 1, and those are inside the database testDB. If not MySQLi error no, passing it $SQLDB. Error checking, so important. I wish I had room to do error checking after every one of these commands. The exclamation point means not. Read this as if not an error. mysqli underscore error no returns false when the query worked and an error number when it does not. This is why an error check on mysqli connect is needed. This query will fail if the connect did not work. I guarantee it. Any missing parentheses or comma or keyword in query string causes an error. You've got to be very careful when you're typing in the command. If I had spelled table wrong or missed a comma or a parenthesis somewhere, this command would fail and this error checking would be very important. SQL is like any other computer language. Picky syntax. Leave off a parentheses, spell something wrong, and the command will not work. Always do your error checking. Print create table my tab complete. This is a simple message to verify my SQLi query worked. It only prints if not an error. When testing and debugging, you want to see this message, but on a live web page, not so much. Use a debug flag to turn it on and off if you want. I generally don't like to see these messages popping up on a live web page, so find a good way to kind of verify the database is open without splashing it across the web page. Note, mysqli error no is an error check that is different from the one on the connect. Go back to the previous slide to see how you properly check for connect errors. This is how you check for query errors. Note that error no is short for error number. And we're not going to execute it. We're going to skip past this exit. But I want to show it to you. This will only execute when the query fails. Call mysqli underscore error and pass it SQLDB to print why the query failed. Usually I end up Googling that error to get better details. Hopefully the error message is good and clear, but if the message that prints is not clear, go ahead and Google part of the error message and it should give you a good idea what happened. This is a call to exit. It's correct in this case. No way to use the database without a table. Remember, what failed here was creating a table on the disk drive. Well, without a table, we're not using this database. I think it's a good idea to go ahead and exit the program. You could also call the die function here. Die and exit are the exact same function. I do want to reiterate on the error checking. mysqli underscore error is for checking for a query error. When you're doing a check for connection error, use this call to a function. Connection errors are slightly different than query errors, so make sure you use the proper syntax and function calls. Whoa! Did you see the scroll? I couldn't fit this whole program on one screen, so what I did is we did the first half of the program, and then we slid up the code, and now we're seeing the remainder of the same program. And what I mean by that is we've already run the code to create the table and connect to the database. We're all set up. Let's now put some data into our table. We continue the program that created the table and we'll now add data to that table. It kind of reads like in English. Insert into a table my tab the values row 0 and ABC. The pattern is simple. Create an SQL command. Send it to MySQL as a query. MySQL will then create, insert, etc. per your SQL command. Notice what we've been doing. We set up a string with the SQL command, and then we call a query, and the query does something to the database. $query equals mysqli underscore real underscore escape string. This function is simpler than it looks. In $query, notice the single quotes around row 0 and ABC. Notice how I had to put single quotes here. Well, why did I do that? Because we're inside a double quoted string, and if I try to use double quotes here, it would totally mess up this double quote. So we have to be very careful how we quote things within strings. Same thing for SQL commands. This function fixes any special characters like single quotes or double quotes or \n or \t, so we avoid confusion as to what exactly is stored. For example, for \n, do we store two characters, \n, or one new line character. This will clean up any special characters that are needed inside the query string so we can send it on to the database. mysqli underscore query. This is the important command. This is what sends commands to change the database. You pass it the parameters. We're used to those now. Whoop, there it is. mysqli query sends SQL command to an active connection $SQLDB, which then inserts the data into the table MyTab. Up to this point, it's all been required setup. This is real data stored in row and column relational database format. Follow the arrows. Data, a row, is written to a disk file. This command going through $SQLDB will send information to the server. The server will then put it on the database, and there's the actual real data, row 0 and ABC, being written to the hard drive. This data right here, this command puts it onto the hard drive. If not mysqli underscore error no. Exclamation point means not. Read this as if not an error. mysqli error no returns false when the query worked and an error number when it does not. An error check is needed. Query will fail for any missing parentheses or quotes or misspellings. Anything, a comma out of place, will cause this query to fail. You need to check for errors. SQL is like any other computer language. It has a picky syntax. It will fail if anything is wrong with this variable or this query. Always do your error check. Print insert row 0 complete. When a website is created, you write a utility script to create the database, the tables, and insert initial records. In that type of script, you will write messages like insert row 0 complete. You need to see that every database, table, and record is good because it's easy to fix at this point when you're just setting out the data. However, for a live website, a website that is running and showing pages to the user, you might not display a message like this. That's a little too literal. You might just say something like quiz scored 5 out of 5 was saved and never even mention that it was an SQL operation at all. All I'm saying is this is a rather generic print confirmation. You might want to do something more specific if you're building a live website. Of course, if this was true and the message printed, we'll skip the else. But it needs to be there. For the utility script that creates a database, the tables, and inserts initial records, everything is a fatal error call. Exit is an easy way to fix it at this point. For a live website, be more careful. Not everything is a fatal error. When a simple results not available message will do. That beats stopping the web page from loading the rest of the screen. Only the most serious errors should exit or die. $query equals insert into MyTab the values row 1 and DEF. Let's build an SQL query to insert a second row. Like arrays, we number them from 0, so it's row 0, row 1, column 0, column 1. It kind of reads in English like this. Insert into table the values row 1 DEF. The pattern is simple. Create an SQL command, send it to MySQL as a query. MySQL will then create insert per your SQL command. $query equals mysqli real escape string. This function is simpler than it looks. In $query, notice the single quotes around row 1 and DEF. Single quotes required inside of double quotes, like these double quotes here, or it totally messes up the string. Even when I don't think I need to call this function, I do. Because the one time I don't call this function on a query, that's when I'll need it. Just call this to make sure that any special characters inside your query are properly handled when they're sent to the database. MySQLi query, passing it $SQLDB, and my query string from above. Whoomp, there it is. Are we getting tired of that saying? I think I am. My SQLi query sends an SQL command to an active connection $SQLDB, which then inserts data into table MyTab. This is real data stored in row and column relational database format. Follow the arrows. New data, a row, is written to the disk file. This command will go through $SQLDB, through the server MySQL, and out to the disk drive goes row 1 DEF. The reason I always use the whoomp, there it is that's the thing that is writing to the database. MySQLi underscore close $SQLDB. Very, very, very important. You must close the connection when you're done. Number 1, you don't get unlimited connections to a MySQL server. And number 2, the operating system frees locks placed on disk files. If you want anybody else using and changing this data, you've got to close the connection when you're done. $MySQLDB is not a simple variable. It is an object or structure that allows access and tracks the server connection. After you execute close, any MySQLi call using $SQLDB would fail. Once you close this connection, don't try and use this variable to access the database. Whew. Wow. To wrap up this rather long example, we created a table to store 2 rows. This data is stored on disk, and in the next slide, we'll learn how to extract the data from the table and use it to display information on the web page. But before we leave, I want to point out we created a table and we inserted data into that table. Now we'll look at using that data. SQL Select. Table in, table out. The SQL Select command is probably the most important SQL command you'll ever learn. Here is an SQL table. And the thing you need to understand about an SQL table is a select or query will extract data from that table and hand you back a smaller subset of the data. Let's say we told the database to extract the columns screen name and level. We will grab these 2 columns, pull them out of the database, and return them to the caller. Let's say we told the database extract the rows where the level equals 2. Well, MySQL would go through the database, find these 2 rows where the level equals 2, extract them from the table, and return you this smaller subset of rows from the bigger table. It even gets a little more fancier than that. Let's extract rows, contain the value Yahoo, and the columns email, player ID, and money. So that very specialized query is going to grab just a little bit of the data out of here and return you a subtable or subdata that matches your criteria. That's a key important. Databases get big. You want to extract a smaller set of data to display to the user. And that's what a select command does. Select a certain bit of data from the table and return to me that smaller piece of data. SQL Select. Now it is time to read the data stored in a relational database table. The SQL Select command will select some data from a table. You might say it extracts data from the table. It is the most important SQL command for accessing the information in the database. This is the data stored in a table named players. Other code has written this data and we've already connected and selected this database. The field/column names are technically not data stored in the record, but they are important information for accessing the data, and they are stored in the database. See this arrow right here? This is just telling us that this is data coming from the database stored in our table players. $query equals select star from players. Grab everything from the table. Select and from are SQL keywords or commands. They are uppercase to be easier to spot. They don't have to be uppercase. I want them to be uppercase so you can spot them easily, but they don't have to be uppercase. Star or asterisk is a wildcard that matches everything. Players is the name of the table to access. Read this command out loud as select everything from the players table. $returnval equals mysqli underscore query, passing it the connection variable and the string that contains the select query. The information extracted by the select query will be assigned to a variable called $returnval. See this $returnval contains everything in the table is assigned to this $return value. Since we asked for everything, it will contain the entire table because of the star or asterisk. Select means be selective. Most queries will extract a subset of the table, but this one does it all. This is the easiest select. We just extracted every row from this table. If mysqli error, print this error message, query failed. Very important. Always, always, always error checked. When mysqli error no, $SQLDB, returns a number, the if evaluates to true. You do not always have to exit when a query fails. Often you can format a results not available message and continue with the PHP program. So in this example, I'm trying to show you, you don't have to call exit or die every time. If it's the type of error that you can survive, that doesn't hurt the page too much, just go ahead and print a message to the user. Don't leave the program. Because once you exit, it's done. There's no more code that executes. We'll start simple. Print rows equals mysqli underscore num underscore rows $returnval. Use $retval, short for return value, to get the number of rows or records returned by the query. This is your search returned X matches type of data needed to display those items. $retval contains more than the raw data the query returns. It contains information like how many records matched. And in this case, there were 4 records matched. We returned 1, 2, 3, 4 records from this query. Now let's look at the rows that we did extract. While $record equals mysqli underscore fetch underscore row pass it $retval. Extract a row or record from $retval. Remember, that's short for return value. As a simple array. What gets returned by this command is an array, and $record is a simple array. Since each row / record has 5 columns or fields, $record will be an array with 5 slots. $retval contains all 4 records. This will extract the first row of the 4. Follow the arrows. This command said return this row as an array, and the array was assigned to $record. Print $record subscript 0, $record subscript 2, $record subscript 3. This is a simple print, just to confirm the data in $record. I would have printed all 5 fields if I had the room, but I don't. Note how column 0, or the email, is in $record 0. Column 2, or the screen name, is in $record subscript 2, etc. These are column 0, column 2, and column 3. And you can see column 0, column 2, and column 3 come out on my display. Also note, we are at the end of this while loop, so we'll spin back up and execute the while statement again. While $record equals mysqli underscore fetch underscore row, extract the next row or record from $retval. Again, that's short for return value. As a simple array. Since each row / record has 5 columns or fields, $record will be an array with 5 slots. $retval contains all 4 records. This will extract just the second row of the 4. Follow the arrow. I'm extracting the next row out of the returned table. Print $record0, $record2, $record3. A simple print just to confirm the data in $record. Again, I would have printed all 5 fields if I had the room. Note how the column 0 or email is in $record0. Notice how column 2, or the screen name, is in $record2, etc. And the data is from the next row, row 1 or record 1. This information, tom@gmail, is coming from the next row that we just fetched. Now I could go all day spinning through all the rows of this table, so I'll speed it up a little bit. Let's go ahead and spin twice more in the loop and extract and print records for John and Mac. So I'm not going to step through it, but obviously we called fetch row and we got John and we printed it out. Then we spun back up in the loop, we fetched Mac and we printed it out. Now we spin back up one more time after printing those 2 rows, and let's see the difference. Don't need to see how a loop works, let's just speed it up a little bit. Eventually $retval will reach the ended data, or EOD, and mysqli underscore fetch underscore row returns a false at that point. Whew. So what happened here? We spun a couple more in the loops, but eventually we ran out of data. When we run out of data, EOD, this will be a false statement, and when that turns false, we will exit the while loop and continue on with the program. If it returned 4 rows, we can only print 4 rows. After that, we should exit the loop and continue on. We'll start a new example on the next display. Hang with me here. We're going to run another query on the same data. So I cleared out that old example, and here's a new example. A more sophisticated select. $query equals select ID, money from players where money is greater than 20. Select from where are SQL keywords. They don't have to be in uppercase, but I like to put them in uppercase just to show you, beginning students, which are the important keywords of the command. It is called select because you can select any row or column you want from the data in the table. You do not need to extract the entire table like we did in the last example. You could say, give me this little tiny piece of the table and return it to me. Read this command out loud in English as select columns ID and money from the players table where the money field is greater than 20. That's the command we're going to execute on our database, and it will extract the data that matches from this table. $retval equals mysqli underscore query, passing it the 2 parameters. We're well familiar with these parameters now. The information extracted by the select query will be assigned to $retval. This is table in, table out. This is my table input. The query will extract a subtable and return it to the caller. $retval is a smaller table extracted from the larger table. Select the intersection. Select the intersection of columns ID and money with the rows where money is greater than 20. Follow the arrows. Here is a row where the money is greater than 20. Here is a row with the money greater than 20. Within those 2 rows, I only want the ID column and the money column. Extract that information, and I will return a subtable containing just that smaller piece of data. I've just extracted a piece of the table, not the entire thing. If mysqli underscore error, print a query failed message. It is very important, always error check. When mysqli error no returns a number, the if evaluates to true and the message will print. If there's a problem with $SQLDB or $query, it would have failed. Simple spelling mistakes. Spell select wrong and this command will fail. If there's a problem with $SQLDB, it will fail. Hopefully you'll get a good error message, but if not, Google the error message and it should lead you to the solution. While $arec equals mysqli underscore fetch underscore array, passing it $retval. Extract a row or record from $retval, and that's short for return value, as an associative array this time. The output of this command is going to be slightly different. This will be an associative array. That's why I put an A in front of it. The columns will be the key to the array. So ID will be the key that allows me to access this data. Money will be the key that allows me to access this column. That is what a select query really does. It extracts a subset of the rows and columns, and now we can loop through that subset. Print ID is $arec with the ID key, $arec with money as the key. Simple print just to confirm the data in $arec. Note how the column/field name is the key in the associative array, used to print the value from the query. Now we're not going to use a simple array, we're going to use an associative array, and the keys in the associative array are the columns. We've hit the end of this loop, so we'll spin back up for that while statement. While $arec equals mysqli underscore fetch underscore array, passing it $retval. Extract the next row or record from $retval, which is the return value, as an associative array. It is common to loop through a subset of the return records from a select query and output the result, and that's what we're doing. We will grab this row from our result and assign it to this associative array. Print ID and then $arec with ID as the key, $arec with money as the key. This is a simple print to confirm the data in $arec. Note how the column/field name is the key in the associative array used to print the value from the query. You can see my query above returned this data, and I just loop through it and print out the data the query returned. That's basically how a website works. Just about everything you do on a website goes out to a database, extracts some data, and replies to the user and shows them the result. Go to Amazon. Say I want to buy a game controller. It will go out to the database, pull out the game controllers, loop through them, and show them to you on the screen. While $arec equals mysqli fetch array. Extract the next row or record from $retval, or the return value. Returns false this time. We've run out of data in our query reply. We've reached end of data. What? It's time to exit the loop. When this command returns a false, we leave the while loop and continue on with the program. This code is done. Whew. Finally. All right, so I just set up a couple of quick examples to show you how to change data in the database now. We're going to set up a $query and set it equal to update players, set money equal to 15, where email equals john@ucla.edu. I think you can decide just by looking at it what this command is going to do. It's going to update the database, and it's going to update John's record in the database. I'll send it off as a query, and what do queries do? They change or access or modify the database in some way. Look at the command above. I wanted to set money equal to 15. I'm going to change the money field in the record that contains john@ucla.edu. You should be able to look at this query and understand why that 15 changed. By the way, I'm skipping error checking here. I'm tired of error checking. It takes up too much space on the screen. You understand that you need to do error checking on all of these commands. $query equals update players set SC name to ACE, where the ID equals 67890. Think about it. Find 67890 in the database and change the SC name. I'm not even doing my extra print statements here on the side because these update queries are pretty self-explanatory, I hope. Look at what's happening here. We said set SC name to ACE, and ACE shows up in the data of our database. And where did we set ACE? We set it where the ID equals 67890, and you can see that right there. Now, I went through these examples pretty quick. Of course, you have to connect to the database. You got to make sure it's selected before this happens. And of course, at the end, you'd have to close the database connection to make sure this data actually got written out to the hard drive. But that's it. It's pretty simple to update data stored in a database. This slide was way too long. I am tired. I got one more thing to cover and we'll be done with this lesson. Object-oriented MySQL. PHP is a procedural programming language, but it is also an object-oriented programming language. You, the programmer, have a choice when you write a PHP program. I can do it in a procedural style, or I can do it in an object-oriented style. Well, it turns out MySQL is the same way. MySQL code can be written in a procedural style, or it can be written in an object-oriented style, and you, the programmer, get to decide which way you want to write the code. It's the program designer or coder's choice which paradigm to use when writing both PHP and MySQL. Object-oriented MySQL. First and foremost, everything we learned in procedural MySQL still applies. All we have to learn here is a slightly different technique for doing the same thing. Instead of calling the procedural function mysqli_connect, we will build a mysqli object that will connect for us. Instead of calling the procedural mysqli_query, we'll use the object and call the query method with the object. It's very, very similar. If you paid attention to the earlier slides, this slide should be pretty self-explanatory. The big difference, though, will be using objects instead of calling functions. $SQLDB equals new mysqli and pass it the four parameters we should be very familiar with now. This is the server address, this is the username, this is the password, and this is the database name. To connect to a MySQL server, create a mysqli object. The parameters are the same: host name, username, password, and database name. From this point, we'll use the MySQL DB object in the same way we use the MySQL DB variable in procedural MySQL. I really debated calling this a different name. I debated calling it $SQL OBJ. But I wanted to use the same name because it's basically serving the same purpose as the variable did in the previous slide. Also notice we've built an object in computer memory. Objects store data. Things like the server address, the username, and the database name are stored within the object. Error checking. We can never get away from error checking, but we're going to do it in a slightly different manner now that we're object oriented. We're going to say if $SQLDB, and this arrow says access or go inside the object and look for the connect_error variable. That's different. We're going to check a variable here, not call a function. Objects contain variables and methods. This code is accessing the connect_error variable and the error variables. These are both variables, not functions. We know these are properties or variables because there's no parentheses like with a method. And there are many more variables in this object. If you Google MySQLi class, you could see that there's lots of variables in there. I only printed a few of them that we're using, but there's many variables as well as many methods in these objects. Remember, objects have variables and methods. $SQLDB arrow query and pass it this query. Insert into my tab the values Tom and 123. Use the $SQLDB object to execute the query method. We know it's a method because of the parentheses. Look at the arrows. See, immediately after the word query is an open paren, and then there's a match here on the other side. This tells you that's a method. With no open parentheses, that is a variable. With this open parentheses there, I know that is a method. Objects contain variables and methods. The query method is just one of. There are methods for every procedural function we have studied. I put a few of them down here: query, select, db, close. There are methods that we call just like we called the functions before. More importantly, when this command executes, we will add a row to our table containing Tom and 123. $SQLDB arrow query and pass it this SQL command. Let's add another row to our table containing Sue and 456. Use the $SQLDB object to execute the query method. Let's compare them side by side. Here is the object-oriented call to execute a query. Here is the procedural function call to execute a query. See the sameness? Instead of passing $SQLDB as a parameter to a function, we're using the object SQLDB to run the query. They're not much different, are they? Use the object $SQLDB to run the method versus the variable $SQLDB versus passing the variable $SQLDB. So now we have some data in our database. Let's go access it in an object-oriented manner. $retval equals $SQLDB and execute the query method select star from my tab. Use the $SQLDB object to execute the select everything query. This returns another object $retval. This object contains variables with the query results, methods for accessing those results. You can see the object below. Some of the query return objects data or code. $returnval or $retval is yet another object in computer memory. And there's going to be all sorts of stuff in $retval. This is the query return object. For instance, it'll keep track of how many rows the query returned. It will keep track of the data the query returned. And of course, it will have methods that will access that data. That's object-oriented programming. You get variables, you get methods. Let's access those variables and methods. If $retval arrow numRows is greater than 0. What's going on here? Use the $retval object to access the variable numRows. 2 greater than 0 is true. Let's execute the if block. Now, how do I know this is a variable? Because there's no parentheses after rows. This must be a variable inside of that object, and there it is pointed out on the screen. Way back when we did the object-oriented lesson, I said declare your variables private. Apparently, this person didn't get the memo. These are public variables. numRows is a public variable because I'm accessing it directly. Error is a public variable because I'm accessing it directly. Lack of parentheses means this has to be a variable. You need to start spotting the clues in the object. When you see $object arrow, the arrow means we're dealing with an object on the left side of the arrow. When you see $object arrow var with no parentheses, this must be a variable, just like numRows must be a variable. When you see $object arrow anything with parentheses following it, that is an object running a method, like we did here with query. Spot the clues in the code and you'll understand it much better. While $rec equals $returnval arrow fetch assoc. Fetch an associative array. Use $retval object to execute the fetch underscore assoc method. As the name implies, it returns an associative array assigned to $rec, which is short for record. Fetch assoc will return one row from the query each time it is called, and it will return false when there are no rows. So it's called, it fetches this one row, right? Fetch assoc fetches the first row of what the query returned, and it sends it back and assigns it to $rec. Print select rec of name, rec of ID. This is a simple print statement. Output the data in the associative array $rec. What does this code tell you? Number one, there is a column or field name. Number two, there is a column or field ID. Remember, when it's an associative array, this is the column name from the table. Could be more fields, but there's at least those two in this record. This also completes the loop. We'll spin back up on the while loop. While $rec equals $return value. Now remember, we're going to the return value object. This is the object returned by the query right here. Use the $retval object to execute fetch associate method. $retval tracks which rows have been returned, so fetch associate will return to $rec the next row from the query each time it is called, and false when there are no more rows. So we call it fetch associate again. It grabs the next row in the query output and sends it back to the caller in $rec. Print select record name, record ID. Simple print statement. Output the data in the associative array $rec. This confirms $rec contains the second row or record from the table returned by the select everything query. Once again, the loop is done. We've reached the end of the while loop, and we'll spin back up on the while loop. While $rec equals $return value fetch associative. Use the $retval object to execute the fetch associate method. $retval tracks which rows have been returned, so fetch associate will return to $rec the next row from the query each time it's called, and false when there are no more rows. Well, it turns out when fetch associate went to get the next row, it wasn't there. It reached end of data. When it reaches end of data, it returns a false, and this while loop will exit. There were only 2 rows inserted into the table, so I can only select 2 rows out of it. After I print them out, the loop is done. It's time to exit the loop. The else was skipped because the if was true. I want to point out how this is a non-fatal error, how it's handled. When a select query fails and no rows from the database are found, num rows would be set to 0. See this little variable in return val? If that was set to 0, then this select returned a nothing from the table. Well, that's not really a fatal error. It just means your search didn't work. And if your search doesn't work, you shouldn't blow up the whole program. You should just print out a little no results found and tell the user that didn't work. 0 should simply display that message. There's no need to call exit or die for a select that returns 0 rows. SQLDB arrow close. Very important. You must close the connection when you're done. Number 1, you don't get unlimited connections to a MySQL server. Number 2, the operating system frees locks placed on any disk files. It's important to close the connection when you're done. One last object-oriented point. Just compare the 2 commands side by side. This is the object-oriented way to call close. We use the object to execute the close method. This is the procedural or function way to close it. Call the function MySQL close and pass it the variable that had the connection open. Whew! I like that one because it lets us review object-oriented programming. Procedural or object-oriented MySQL. If the bulk of the code for your web page is written in procedural PHP, then use procedural MySQL. Call the functions. If your website is written in object-oriented PHP, then use object-oriented MySQL. But as always, it comes down to the programmer or designer's choice. Are you more procedural? Are you more object-oriented? Use it the way you like. They are very, very similar with the one tiny exception of we tend to use the variables directly. I'm not sure I like using variables directly, but the designer of this object/class decided to make these variables public, so quite often we can access the public variables directly. That's it. That was a lot of data. I hope you got it all. If not, go back and rewatch the parts you don't understand. We'll see you in the next lesson.